The men of Crane Flat called Martha Coyle's house the Wool Cave, and they laughed at it in the open street. They laughed at the door in the hillside. They laughed at walls stacked from wool bales. They laughed at the stovepipe that came out of the ground 20 feet from her own roof. Harlan Dietz, who sold sawn pine to every family on the flat, said a Christian woman lived above the dirt, not inside it. By the end of that winter, his cabin stood frozen through like a meat locker. 11 of his neighbors were alive because of hers. 1887 came in hard on the high plains. The winter before, it had killed cattle by the tens of thousands from Montana down through the Dakota Range country. Ranchers called it the Great Die-Up, and nobody who lived through it said the words lightly. Amos Coyle did not live through it. He went out in a February whiteout to move his sheep off an exposed bench and never found the fence line home. Martha buried him in April, when the ground gave enough to dig. She was in her early 40s, fair-skinned, hair pinned back, and alone. The bank took the flat parcel and the plank house on it. That was the mortgage, and the mortgage did not care that she had paid faithfully for 6 years. What the bank did not want was the broken quarter on the hill, too steep to plow, cut with a dry ravine. Amos had proved it up years before and dug a half dugout into the south slope for a lambing shelter. The bank men never even rode up to look at it. Martha signed for it. She took her dog, her wagon, and 90 ewes and moved up the hill. She noticed the first thing before she ever unloaded the wagon. It was a raw April day with wind-driving sleet. Inside the old lambing dugout, the air stood still and mild. No fire had burned in it for 2 years. She put her palm flat against the cut earth wall and held it there. The ground was not warm, but it was not winter either. It was the same steady cool it would be in August. 6 feet down, the earth forgot what the sky was doing. A sod or dugout wall did not fight the weather. It simply refused to hear about it. She thought about Amos's last winter in the plank house, the stove roaring cherry red and the water bucket freezing solid 6 feet from it. A board wall was an inch of pine between a family and the wind. Wind did not just make cold. Wind carried heat away as fast as a body or a stove could make it, the same as blowing across hot soup. That was why a still night at 10 below felt kinder than a blowing night at 10 above. The hill would never be fashionable. But the hill did not blow. The wool was the second thing, and the wool was an accident of ruin. Wool prices had collapsed that spring. Freighting her clip to the railhead would eat most of what the buyer paid. 40 heavy bales came back up the hill with her, sacked tight in burlap, each one dense as a feed barrel. They sat in the dugout mouth all through May while she lambed. She stacked them too deep across the north end to break the draft off the door. The lambs bedded against that wool wall every cold night. She watched them choose it over the stove corner, night after night, and she paid attention. A wool bale was mostly trapped air. That was the whole secret of it. The same secret as goose down or a snowdrift over a wintering vole. Still air was the best blanket there was. Wool held air still in a million small pockets that would not pack flat. Wool would keep some warmth even damp, which cotton would not. And a packed wool bale would not take flame easily. Loose wool scorched and stank. A dense bale starved a flame of air, charring and going out, sulking instead of burning. She tested it herself, a live coal on a sacrificial bale end, a wet sack standing by. The ember died in the fibers. She spent that summer building what the flat could see, and what the flat could see made her a joke by July. She cut the dugout deeper and wider, roofed it with cottonwood beams, plank, tar paper, and 2 feet of packed earth. She faced the front with log and stone and hung a heavy plank door. Then she lined the inside, floor to ceiling, with a double wall of wool bales. She set them 2 rows thick, a hand's width of air gap between them, tied back to the beams so they could not lean. Over the inner face she nailed stretched burlap. She troweled it with clay plaster, 3 coats, until the wall was smooth and pale and hard. The plaster was not for looks. Bare burlap and wool near a stove was asking for a smolder, and clay would not burn at all. The plaster also sealed the wool from sparks, from lamp accidents, and from the little teeth of mice. She raised every bale off the floor on cedar skids. Wool that wicked ground damp would rot, mat, and lose its loft. Dry wool was a wall. Wet wool was a compost pile with ambitions. She left the air gap between the rows for the same reason a man wears 2 shirts instead of 1 thick one. 2 walls with still air between them beat 1 wall of double weight. Dietz rode up in August with 2 men from the sawmill, since half the town had asked him about it. He stood in the doorway with his hat on and looked down the pale plastered room. He knocked on the plaster and heard the dull, dead sound of the wool behind it. "You built a root cellar and moved into it," he said. "I sell house lumber a mile from here, and you packed yourself in wool like a china cup." "The china cup gets there whole," Martha said. He laughed, not unkindly, and that was somehow worse. By September the name was everywhere, at the store, at the church, at the school, the wool cave. Children said it to her face because their fathers said it at supper. When she bought her winter flour, the storekeeper asked if she wanted it delivered to the burrow. The flue under the floor was the part of the build nobody on the flat had ever seen. It was the part they could least forgive. Martha had not invented it. A Basque herder named Esteban had wintered with the Coils years back. He had told Amos about the stone-floored winter huts in the mountains of his country. "You did not sit beside your fire there," he said. "You sat on top of its smoke." The fire burned low in a pit at one end. Its smoke crawled through a stone channel under the floor to a chimney at the far end, and the floor itself became the stove. The sense of it was plain once she laid it out with a stick in the dirt. Smoke leaving an ordinary stovepipe was heat leaving the house, most of a fire's warmth thrown straight at the sky. Run that same smoke the long way through a channel of flat stones. The stones drank the heat out of it before letting it go. Stone and packed earth held warmth the same way they held the summer's cool, slowly taken, slowly given back. A floor of heated stone would go on shedding warmth all night from a fire that had died at dusk. It heated the one place heat was always poorest, down at the floor where children sat and sleepers lay. Warm air rises and leaves the ankles for last. She dug the channel through the dugout floor in a long S so the smoke would take its time. She lined and capped it with flat creek stones, mudded every joint with clay, and packed the floor smooth over it. The firebox sat by the door, a squat iron stove on a stone apron. The chimney rose at the back of the hill through 8 feet of ground. It took her from September into October, working alone with a spade, a stone boat, and the dog for conversation. She tested every joint by burning green cedar and crawling the room, sniffing for leaks like a hound. A smoke leak was not a small thing, and she knew it the hard way. Her father had lost a hired man to a banked coal stove in a sealed bunkroom when she was a girl. The man had not woken coughing. He had simply not woken. Smoke you could smell was a warning, but coal gas gave hardly any warning at all. Only a headache, a drowsiness, a sleep that went deeper than sleep. Any fire in a tight room needed 2 mouths to the outside. one to feed it air, and one to carry off its breath. A fire that could not pull fresh air would push its smoke backward into the room sooner or later. She cut a fist-sized vent through the doorframe near the floor, fitted it with a slide, and told herself she had thought of everything. The town found out about the buried flue when Dietz's yardman delivered her stovepipe collars and saw the trench. The story improved with every telling. She burned her fire in a grave. She smoked herself like a ham. At the store in November, the storekeeper quietly asked for cash, where he had always carried her over to wool season. She paid cash and drove up the hill with her jaw set. What none of them asked about was the other arithmetic. Her ewes came through November on half the hay a plank barn would have begged for. The shed she cut beside her own room shared the hill's stillness. A sheep, like a stove, is a small furnace. Feed is fuel. Every hour of wind that combed through a plank barn was hay burned for nothing. Her band stood quiet in still air and turned their feed into wool and lamb instead of into heat for the county. She wrote the figures in Amos's old ledger, hay in, weight held, and the ledger did not laugh at her. The first hard test came in the middle of December, and the wool cave failed it in front of everybody. A gray norther blew down in the night, the first true cold of the winter. Martha built the fire up and slid her floor damper wide. Within an hour, the room began to sting her eyes. Smoke was seeping up along the floor joints at the far end and curling from around the chimney thimble. The fire fluttered, sulked, and breathed backward, coughing gray into the room every time the wind gusted. She got the fire drowned and the door open. She stood in the driving cold at midnight, coughing, while her home exhaled smoke like a hive being robbed. The mail rider saw the smoke haze and the open door at dawn and had the story in town by noon. Dietz did not even have to sharpen it. The widow had nearly smoked herself in her own burrow, exactly as predicted. Men laughed at the lumber yard, laughed at the livery. The schoolteacher, Ada Pruitt, was the only one who came up the hill to ask if she was hurt. Martha, red-eyed in her doorway, said she was not. "They are saying the hill house doesn't draw," Ada said. "Careful with it." "It draws fine in still weather," Martha said. "It's the wind killed it, and that's my fault, not the hills. I set my chimney low to hide it from their laughing. Short chimney, low on a slope, on the downhill side of the weather. The wind rolls over this hill and slaps straight down on it." She had it half right that morning, and the other half came to her while she watched snow blow across the chimney mouth. Wind pouring downslope drove into the flue faster than the warm smoke could climb out, and her little door vent had drifted shut outside, so the fire was starving besides, sucking for air down the only open pipe it had. A chimney was not a hole. It was an engine that ran on warm air rising. Everything about hers had been placed to please her pride instead of the draft. The fix was stone, mortar, and sheet iron. She needed it before deep winter, and she had no money for it. What she had was Caesar, her Cotswold ram, the best blood on the hill, and the whole future of her flock's wool. A breeder over on Crow Creek had wanted him for 2 seasons. Selling the flock's future to save its present was the kind of trade that could not be taken back. Martha drove Caesar to Crow Creek the day after Christmas. She drove home with the money in her coat and did not let herself look back at the pen. Dietz heard about the sale, because Dietz heard about everything. Selling her ram to fix a chimney in a hole. At the lumber yard they reckoned she would be cooking over buffalo chips in a tent by March. He said it where her nephew by marriage could hear it, and it traveled up the hill the same week. Martha read the message in it clearly enough. Nobody was going to catch her. There was no bottom under her but the one she built. She rebuilt the chimney first. She carried it up in mortared stone until its mouth stood taller than the rise of the hill behind it. Wind sweeping the slope now passed over it, instead of pouring into it. A flue mouth below a nearby ridge sat in tumbling, down-driving air. The same mouth carried above that line sat in clean wind that swept across it and pulled. On top she set a cowl the blacksmith rolled for pay, a hood of sheet iron on legs, open at the sides, closed at the top. Wind from any quarter had to pass across the opening instead of down it. Passing wind did not push at a flue. It pulled on it, like breath drawn over a bottle's neck. The second mouth got the same respect. She dug her air intake uphill of the door, a wooden box duct coming up under the stove's stone apron. Now the fire drank from outside instead of stealing the room's air. Its outside mouth she raised on a short stone stack, capped and screened, above any drift she had ever seen off that slope. Indoors she cut a slide damper she could reach from the stove. 2 mouths, both above the snow, one low into the fire and one high off the floor's far end. The room could breathe with the door buried, if it ever came to that. While the mortar cured, she went at the winter as a siege she intended to outlast. The government circulars about the die-up winter had been blunt. The families that died on the plains mostly did not freeze in their homes. They froze between buildings, lost 10 steps from their own doors in whiteout. Or they starved waiting out storms with a week's supplies and a month's weather. So she strung fence wire waist high from her door to the sheep shed, and from the shed to the spring box. She hung the wire with strips of red flannel that would show against snow. Inside, she stacked what a month of siege would ask for: flour, beans, salt pork, dried apples, a barrel of potatoes buried in sand, kerosene, candles, and cordwood ranked along the south wall. The wood was split fine, because a buried stove ran best on a small, hot, steady fire, not a big smoldering one. Water was the quiet trap in a long storm. Eating snow chilled a body from the inside. Melting it took more stove and more time than anybody believed, a bucket of powder yielding hardly an inch of water. She kept the spring box path wired, and 2 milk cans full standing by the door besides. Ada Pruitt came up twice in January, once with mending, and once, plainly, because the town's laughter had begun to bother her conscience. She was a small, quick woman who had taught school through 4 plains winters. She asked real questions, which made her rare. Martha walked her the length of the floor and let her stand stocking-footed on the stones over the flue run. "It's like standing on a hearth," Ada said. "The whole floor." "That's near about what it is," Martha said. "The smoke pays rent on its road out. Stone holds heat slow, same as it holds the cold slow. Come here at noon in July, that floor will be cool. And the wool. Everyone says the wool will burn. Packed wool hates to burn. It chars and quits. Loose and greasy, it'll smolder, so it lives behind clay where sparks can't court it." Martha rapped the pale plaster wall. "Hot fires are for stovepipes and open flues. A buried one you run small and clean, and you never bank it tight and seal the room. Smoke tells on itself. The gas off choking coals doesn't. That's why the room has 2 mouths I can mind from the stove. My schoolhouse has 1 stove, 1 door, green cottonwood, and 60 feet of board wall a man can see daylight through," she said. "The board says it's plenty. For a morning of weather, it's plenty," Martha said, and let it lie. Preaching her house at people had bought her nothing but the name of the town fool. Proof kept its own schedule. The rebuilt chimney got its trial in the 2nd week of January, a 2-day blow shrieking off the slope. The flue never faltered. The cowl rode the gusts and pulled steadier the harder the wind ran. The floor stones went warm at dusk, and were still shedding heat at dawn from a firebox of gray coals. She crawled the room with a candle, checking every plaster joint for the flutter of a leak, and found the flame standing straight. In the ledger she wrote that the fault had been hers, and the fix had been bought with Caesar. The wall between her and the weather now had no lie left in it that she knew of. She wrote that last part deliberately, that she knew of, because certainty was the plank house disease. Every man on the flat was certain, and not a one of them had tested anything. Winter did the testing in that country, and winter set its own examinations. Toward the end of the month, the weather went strange and gentle. A false thaw softened the drifts, and the sky turned a hazed and milky yellow. Sundogs stood beside the sun in the mornings, bright pillars of ice light that old herders read as a promise of brutal cold behind them. Her ewes came off the slope early 2 days running and packed themselves into the shed without being driven. The dog would not settle. The air felt like held breath. The norther came on the last Thursday in January, and it did not arrive like weather. It arrived like a wall falling over. Martha was hauling water at midday under that milky sky when the northwest horizon turned a bruised blue-black and began to grow. For a quarter hour there was no wind at all. There was only that rising dark, and a sound under the ground like a train that never got closer. Then the temperature broke and fell like something cut loose. The air went from soft thaw to searing cold in the time it took her to pen the ewes. The wind arrived with its snow already in it, a white wall running 50 miles an hour, and the world went blind. A plains blizzard did not snow down. It snowed sideways. Half of what blinded you was old snow off the ground, milled fine as flour, driven so thick a man could not see his own hand at the end of a swinging lantern. In that first hour, she later learned, men all over the county were caught between barn and house. That was the killing distance, those 40 familiar steps. Cold killed slow, but blindness killed fast, walking men in circles 100 yards from their own stoves until their legs gave. Martha came in along her flannel-tagged wire, hand over hand. The wire was the only reason she came in at all. She thought first of her own band, Shed Fast, and Hay Deep. Then she thought of the schoolhouse at the foot of her hill road, and her stomach turned over. School had been in session. If anyone had read the sky in time, the children had been sent scattering home ahead of it. If not, they were sitting in a single boardroom with green cottonwood and a tin stove, while the cold came through the walls like the walls were not there. She banked her stove small and hot, lit the big brass lantern, and took the coiled picket rope. She went back out into the roar with the dog against her knee. The schoolhouse sat 200 yards down, and her wire ran most of it, strung in the fall to reach the road gate. She went wire to wire, tied the picket rope at the gatepost. She made the last stretch on the rope's length with the lantern held high. The schoolhouse door was drifting shut already. Inside, in coats, mittened hands over ears, sat Ada Pruitt and the last 2 children nobody had come for. The Sunderland girl and the little Voss boy, 8 and 10. With them was Levi Hart, a young farmer who had been riding past when the wall hit and had stopped to wait it out. The stove was eating green wood and losing. The water pail by the door had already skimmed with ice. "We can't stay ahead of it," Ada said. Her lips were stiff with cold. "It's coming through the floor." Levi wanted to run for town. "Town is a mile," Martha said. "You'd all be dead in the first quarter of it. My door is 200 yards, and there's a rope and a wire the whole way. We go now, while I can still find my own line. Tie the children's wrists to my rope. Nobody's hand comes off it, whatever they hear, whatever they think they see." That was the lesson the plains taught over and over, and she said it to them straight while she tied knots. In a whiteout you did not trust your legs, your eyes, or your certainty. Men died sure of their direction, walking with the wind at an angle, curling their line off into the open range. You trusted the rope. If the rope was wrong, you followed it back to where it was right. Wind at her left cheekbone the whole way, she led them up her own hill blind. The wool cave's door came out of the white like a hatch on a sinking ship. Inside, the stillness struck the children silent. The roar dropped to a mutter in the chimney, and the lantern light lay warm on pale clay walls. When Ada knelt to strip wet mittens off small hands, the floor under her knees was warm as a proved bread pan. The Voss boy put both palms flat on the stones and looked up at his teacher as if the floor had done a trick. "Sit the little ones right there on the flue run," Martha said. "Coldest air in any room lives at the floor, but not in this room. Wet wool off, dry blankets on. They warm from underneath while we feed them." The first night was 4 guests, mutton stew, and the wind trying the door like a dog testing a fence. The second day it got worse instead of better, and the flat began to fail, house by house. Niels Ostrander and his wife came up the wire at gray noon, hoarfrost to the eyebrows. A gust had torn their stovepipe off at the roof, and their bedroom was below freezing, with the stove throwing sparks into the wind. Behind them before dark came the storekeeper and his wife, beaten by plain arithmetic. Their coal was nearly gone, and their board walls passed the cold faster than the base burner could fight it. The mail rider came in on hands and knees, his dead horse left at Martha's gate. If her lantern had not stood lit in the little door glass, he would have crawled past the hill into the ravine. He sat against the wool wall with his hands in a basin of cool water, weeping quietly as the feeling came back. "Cool water first," Martha told the room. "Not hot, and no rubbing frozen skin raw with snow, whatever anyone's grandfather swore. Thawed flesh was burned tender. You warmed it gentle and kept it warmed, because half a thaw was worse than none." Harlan Dietz came on the 3rd morning, and he came the hard way. His chimney had caught in the night, the creosote of a month of slow green fires lighting off like a rifle shot. He had killed it with salt and a wet quilt, then stood guard on his roof ladder in that wind till the pipe went cold. A chimney fire in a blizzard could not even be run from. With his stove dead and unsafe, his house went Arctic in 3 hours. The frost drove him, his wife, and his half-grown son onto the wire line his neighbors said led somewhere. He stood swaying in the wool cave's doorway, with ice in his beard, looking at the room he had named. Whatever it cost him to knock, it did not show for long, because the warmth took men's pride the same as it took the frost. His wife went to the fire. His son went to the floor stones with the other children. Dietz stood with his back against the wool wall for the better part of an hour before he said a word. "How long can you keep this many warm?" he finally asked. "Longer than the storm can keep blowing," Martha said. "Small fire, all it needs. The hill does most of it. The wool does the rest. What I mind isn't the cold. It's the air. 13 people breathing in a buried room. That's why that slide by the stove stays where I set it, and nobody stuffs a rag in the draft because they feel a chill on their boots." Ostrander frowned across the room. "You want the wind coming in? I want the fire fed and the room breathing," she said. "A tight room with a fire in it and no fresh air is how whole families go to sleep and don't wake. It isn't the smoke you smell that kills, it's the gas you don't. Anyone gets a headache in here. Anyone goes strange and sleepy who ought not be tired. You tell me before you tell them to hush." She ran the room like a ship after that, watches and all. 10 grown guests and 2 children in one buried room would come apart without an order to things. Snow was melted in relays on the stove, and everyone was made to drink, thirsty or not. Dry winter air and cold robbed a body of water it never felt itself lose. Bedding rotated, so nobody slept against the door end. The men took turns at the shovel, keeping the doorway clear inside the drift hollow. The dog, to the children's delight, slept flat out on the warmest stone of the floor and could not be persuaded to virtue by anyone. The third night the storm reached into the room and tried the one thing Martha feared, the exact thing that had beaten her in December. She woke past midnight to a wrongness she felt before she named it. The stove, which had muttered steady for 3 days, was fluttering. She lit a candle and held it to the intake slide. The flame that should have leaned hard toward the fire stood nearly straight, wavering. The fire was starving. Behind her in the dark, 13 people breathed, and the youngest of the sleepers had begun to breathe with their mouths open. Ada was awake at her shoulder in a moment. "What is it?" "The drift's gone over my air stack," Martha said, low. "I built its mouth above any drift this slope ever made. This storm's made a bigger one. The fire can't drink, so it'll die back, and then it'll breathe backward. And after that, this room goes bad quiet, the same as a sealed bunkroom." She was already pulling her second coat on. "It's the fault I fixed coming back 1 size larger. I know exactly where the mouth is, and I know exactly what it needs." Levy's heart was up, and Dietz too. There was a short, fierce argument in whispers. She ended it by saying the mouth was her build, her hillside, and her hands knew it blind. Levy came with her on the rope. Dietz anchored it inside the doorway, boot braced on the jamb, paying it out through his fists. It was not lost on anyone, least of all him, whose line he was holding. Outside was not weather. It was a solid thing, a black roaring full of sand-fine ice. The cold went past pain and straight into stupidity, the kind that starts arguing with a body about whether any of it matters. 20 feet up the slope, on a rope she could not see, she found the intake stack by kicking it. It was buried to its cap under 4 feet of packed drift. She and Levi dug it clear with their arms more than the shovel. Then came the move she had rehearsed in her head since December. She jointed the spare stovepipe length from the shed lean to onto the stack's collar, set the screened cap on top, and lashed it with wire to the driven fence post. The mouth now stood another 3 feet above the new drift line. Add height when the snow rises. It was the plainest law on the plains, and men buried their flues every winter anyway. They built for the winter they remembered instead of the winter that was coming. Her hands were wooden clubs by the time the wire was twisted off. Levy had to close her fingers around the rope for the trip down. Dietz took them both in through the door like sacks off a wagon. Inside, the stove caught its breath. The flutter steadied into the low, even pull of a fire drinking clean air. The candle at the slide leaned over and held, pointing at the firebox like a compass finding north. Martha sat on the warm stones with her hands in cool water and shook, and let herself shake. The room pretended not to watch her do it. "That," said Ostrander into the quiet, "is the first chimney I ever heard of that got taller in the middle of a blizzard." "It'll be taller yet by summer," Martha said through her teeth. Snow won. I just argued the margin. The wind blew out its rage through that night and died on the 4th morning, sudden as northers die, like a door closing on a quarrel. The silence woke everyone. Dietz's son was first out the door and stood in the drift hollow calling for the rest to come look. The sky was a hard, aching blue from rim to rim, the sun small and fierce. The flat below lay drowned in white to the windowsills, drifts carved and combed like a frozen sea. The cold was ferocious still, 40 below and windless, but it was honest cold now, cold you could see, and it could be survived by anyone who respected it. What lay under that shining quiet came clear over the next days, and none of it was pretty. Stock dead in fence corners the whole length of the county. Cattle drifted before the wind for miles until wire or ravine stopped them. 2 men frozen to death out on the open range roads. On Crane Flat itself, every plank house had frozen through, pumps burst, potatoes in the cellars gone to black mush, water barrels split by ice. The schoolhouse's north wall had cracked its studs under the drift load. Board walls had taken a weight of snow no one had ever framed them to carry. Dietz's house stood scorched around its chimney and cold as a well. Not one soul from the flat had died, and every soul on it knew where the town had spent the storm. Her ewes came through to the last animal, shed warm and hay-fed. They had drunk from the spring box down her wired path each day of the blow. The band had cost her almost nothing extra to hold. That arithmetic, the quiet ledger kind, would matter to every stockman who heard it. Feed burned fighting wind was money burned. Still air was money saved. The hill had been keeping her books all winter. The guests dug the doorway out, which took the men half a morning. They went down the hill in 2s and 3s along the wire, back to houses that needed thawing like sides of beef. Ada was last to go. She stopped in the doorway where Dietz had once stood laughing with his hat on. "You'll have every one of them up here by Sunday asking how it's done," she said. "Then I'll tell them," Martha said. "All of it. Including the December I smoked myself out, and the night the drift nearly took the air. They should hear the mistakes louder than the rest. It's the mistakes that teach." She meant it, and she did it, and that was the making of everything after. The Sunday crowd came, sheepish men who a month before had called her home a burrow. She did not spare herself in the telling. She showed them the burned end of the bale she had tested with a coal. She walked them over the flue run and made them stand on it in their socks. She took them up the slope and showed the spliced intake stack. She told them plainly that the wool cave had nearly killed her once by her own bad placing, and had nearly gone bad again on the 3rd night. Nothing built by hands was proof against everything. It was only honest against the failures its builder had bothered to imagine, plus the one margin she had argued back in the dark. "Then, what do I build?" Levi Hart asked her, straight out. "Build into the hill where you have hill," she said. "Where you don't, bank earth to the eaves and pack your walls with what you've got. Wool if you're a sheep man, hay bales plastered tight if you're not. 2 walls trap air, and air is the blanket. Get your chimney high and hooded, above the ridgeline, above the drift. Give every stove 2 mouths, and set both above the snow, and mind them like stock. String your wire lines in October. And keep a month of food and water where you sleep, because the storm decides how long it stays, not you." The proof went on speaking after she stopped. The county paper sent a man in February. He wrote up the hill house that had wintered 13 souls and 90 ewes through the Great Norther, and the piece was reprinted as far away as Omaha. In March, the school board voted to rebuild the cracked schoolhouse banked into the church knoll. Earth to the sills, double-walled, with a high-cowled flue. They paid Martha Coyle 2 days' wages to stand in the fresh-cut trench and tell the masons where the smoke would want to go. Dietz supplied the lumber at his own cost. He never did apologize in words, being the man he was. But that spring his yard began selling flue cowls off the blacksmith's pattern. Men noticed he had stacked 2 courses of wool bales inside his own rebuilt north wall, plastered over, neat as a church. Wool jumped a little that year, as it happened. The joke went around that the widow Coyle had cornered the market by nailing hers to her house. She let the joke run. It was a different kind of laughing now, the kind with respect folded inside it, and she had learned the difference in her bones. Acceptance had not come because the town grew kind. It came because the frost had graded every building on the flat in one blind week, and hers had passed. Passing was a thing not even Dietz could argue with. She did not let the passing make her proud, because pride was what had set her first chimney low. When the thaw came, she went over the wool cave like a doubting inspector, and made the children's chore of it every year after. Pull a plaster patch, check the wool for damp and moth, and plaster it back. Run a lamp flame along every floor joint, looking for the flutter of a leak. Sweep the flue in the chimney before each fall's first fire. The creosote that had nearly burned Dietz's house grew in every slow flue, hers included. Lift the intake caps, clear the screens, and add a joint of pipe whenever the fence posts showed her the drifts were learning to build higher. A shelter was not a thing you finished, it was a thing you kept. Years on, strangers driving the flat road would slow at the sight of it, a green hillside with a tall stone chimney standing out of the grass and a plank door set in the slope. They would ask what fool had built a house inside a hill. The local men, Dietz's son among them by then, had stopped explaining. They settled on the short answer, the joke and the honor in one sentence. That was the wool cave, they said. Coldest week this country ever had, it was the only door on the flat with a lantern in it. Every one of us walked through.